dressed in simple jeans and a leather jacket. No one suspected the man at the check-in counter was Marcus Reid, the billionaire's brother. But in just a few hours, a shocking display of prejudice would expose his true identity and change everything forever. New York International Airport, 5:30 a.m. Though the hour was early, the place buzzed with activity like a beehive in full swing. Bright white lights illuminated the vast space, reflecting off glass walls and polished stone floors. The constant hum of announcements mixed with the sound of rolling luggage, hurried footsteps, and brief, hurried laughter. Amid the bustling crowd, Marcus Reid stepped into the waiting lounge. He wore a worn leather jacket, faded jeans, and scuffed sneakers, nothing that would draw attention. Yet, there was something about him that turned heads, a quiet intensity and eyes so deep they seemed to hold an untold story. No one in the crowd recognized that this unassuming man was the younger brother of billionaire Elijah Reid, the media's darling. While Elijah graced the covers of Forbes and dominated global summits, Marcus had chosen a quieter path, far removed from the glitz and chaos, seeking peace in simpler things. Marcus wheeled his suitcase toward the check-in counter. Behind it stood Greg, a young man with slicked back hair and a face perpetually tinged with sarcasm. Marcus handed over his ticket with a faint smile. "Good morning. Here's my ticket." Greg glanced at the ticket, then quickly sized Marcus up. His eyebrows knit together in skepticism. "First class?" he asked, his tone laced with doubt. "You sure this is your ticket?" Marcus's smile remained steady, unshaken. "Positive." Greg leaned down to scan the ticket, deliberately taking his time. His movements were slow, almost theatrical, as though meant to test the man standing before him. As he worked, he cast a glance at a nearby colleague, muttering just loud enough for Marcus to hear. Another one of them trying to sneak into first class. Marcus heard every word. He didn't flinch. The sting of prejudice was familiar, leaving only a flicker of sadness in his eyes. Quietly, he took the ticket back when Greg returned it, nodding politely. "Thank you. Have a good day." Greg didn't respond. He simply shrugged and turned his attention to the next passenger. Marcus walked away, his suitcase rolling behind him. He left the stares and whispers in his wake, carrying with him the weight of yet another moment that the world had reminded him who it thought he was. After passing through security, Marcus made his way to the departure gate for the 7:45 a.m. flight. He found a quiet corner in the waiting area, tucked his suitcase neatly under his seat, and sat down. The first-class lounge exuded luxury, with black leather armchairs, small coffee tables, and meticulously arranged potted plants. Most of the other passengers, predominantly well-dressed white professionals, sipped coffee or checked emails on sleek laptops. No one paid any attention to Marcus, who sat in silence, his gaze fixed distantly through the large glass window overlooking the tarmac. A service attendant wheeled a drink cart nearby. When offered a cup of coffee, Marcus declined politely, choosing instead to immerse himself in a book, The Cost of Discipleship by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Each page seemed to soothe his soul, a quiet reminder that every trial held purpose within God's grand design. Just then, Evelyn White entered the lounge. As the lead flight attendant for the upcoming flight, she moved with confidence and energy. Her crisp navy uniform was immaculately pressed, her brown hair swept into a tidy bun, and her high heels clicked rhythmically against the floor as she walked. Her eyes landed on Marcus, almost by accident. Something about his expression caught her attention, a quiet composure tinged with melancholy, as though he carried a burden too heavy to share. Without hesitation, Evelyn approached him, her smile warm and genuine. "Good morning. Are you all right? Do you need anything?" Marcus looked up, momentarily surprised by her kindness. It had been a long time since a stranger had reached out to him with such sincerity. Setting his book down, he nodded slightly. "Thank you. I'm fine." Evelyn's smile lingered as her eyes flicked to the book in his lap. "That's a great book. I read it back in college." Bonhoeffer was such a remarkable man. Marcus's eyebrows rose slightly, and a small smile softened his features. He was. his teachings about courage and faith. They resonate deeply. Evelyn nodded in agreement. They really do. I have a feeling this flight might bring you something meaningful. Is this your first time flying with us? Marcus met her gaze, a warm, almost wistful smile playing at his lips. It is, and I think you're right. This flight will be memorable. Evelyn returned his smile, her expression gentle and kind, before excusing herself to continue her work. She had no way of knowing that Marcus's words were more than a casual observation. They carried a weight of unspoken significance. As Evelyn walked away, Marcus leaned back in his chair, his eyes following her briefly before returning to his book. Her small but sincere gesture of concern felt like a beam of light breaking through the clouds of doubt and prejudice he so often endured, reminding him that not everyone saw him through the lens of bias. The announcement echoed overhead, inviting first-class passengers to board. Marcus stood, adjusted his jacket, and rolled his suitcase toward the gate. The airplane door opened, and he was greeted with courteous smiles and soft welcomes from the cabin crew. The first-class cabin of the Boeing 787 resembled a boutique hotel in the sky. Spacious seats upholstered in premium leather, each with its own personal screen, dining table, and private space. Gentle LED lighting bathed the cabin in a calm, luxurious glow. Marcus made his way to his seat by the window. He placed his carry-on bag in the overhead compartment with care, ensuring he didn't disturb anyone else's belongings. Settling into his seat, he adjusted the recline, his movements measured and unobtrusive. Still, a few passengers nearby began to glance his way. Among them was Charles Mackenzie, an older man with silver hair and a sharp gray suit, seated across the aisle. Upon spotting Marcus, Charles raised an eyebrow, his expression a mix of surprise and subtle disdain. Setting down his business magazine, he crossed his arms and murmured just loud enough to be heard. First class sure has gotten more accessible these days. The young woman seated beside him, likely his assistant, looked around uneasily, clearly uncomfortable with the remark. But Charles didn't stop. He picked up the magazine again, glancing at the cover photo, Elijah Reid, Marcus's famous older brother. A sardonic smile tugged at his lips. Looks like someone's trying to follow in Big Brother's billionaire footsteps. Marcus heard every word. He turned toward Charles, his gaze steady and calm, devoid of anger, but heavy with quiet resilience. He exhaled slowly, as though releasing the irritation Charles had tried to ignite. Just then, a flight attendant approached with a warm, professional smile. It was Hannah, assigned to first-class service for the flight. Her voice was gentle, courteous. "Good morning, sir. Can I get you something to drink? We have orange juice, wine, or perhaps a cocktail?" Marcus returned her smile with a polite nod. "Orange juice, please." "Thank you." As Hannah walked away, Charles continued to watch Marcus, his eyes still sharp with judgment. But Marcus didn't react. Instead, he turned his attention to the window, where the first rays of morning light were beginning to chase away the remnants of darkness across the runway. For Marcus, silence was not a sign of weakness. He knew some battles weren't meant to be fought with words, but with steadfast dignity and unwavering faith. A verse from the book he had read earlier that morning echoed in his mind. "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Closing his eyes for a brief moment, Marcus let the sting of Charles's words fade into nothingness. He reminded himself of a greater purpose, of a journey whose significance even he could not yet fully grasp. Marcus sat quietly in the plush seat of the first-class cabin, his gaze fixed on the oval window. The plane remained stationary on the tarmac, preparing for its 6-hour journey to Los Angeles. Outside, the early morning sunlight slowly pierced through the lingering mist. Baggage carts weaved their way across the runway, and ground crew bustled about, creating a rhythm of calm efficiency, so at odds with the storm of thoughts swirling in Marcus's mind. His silence wasn't just a reaction to the prejudice-laden stares or the sharp words he'd endured earlier. It was also a shield, a fragile barrier holding back the weight of old memories, stories he preferred to leave untouched but which always lingered, waiting to resurface. Every mention of Elijah Reid brought with it an invisible burden pressing heavily on Marcus's shoulders. It wasn't jealousy of his brother's wealth or success that weighed him down, but the expectations of a world that saw their family name as synonymous with greatness. You should be doing something bigger, Marcus. God has given us a unique opportunity in this life, Elijah had said one evening in his opulent Malibu estate. But Marcus had replied simply, I don't need the world to know my name, Elijah. I just want to live in peace and do what I believe is right. That answer had never satisfied Elijah. Marcus knew that to his brother, his quiet way of living seemed like a waste of God-given potential. But Marcus believed otherwise. Not everyone was meant to stand in the spotlight to make a difference. Some were called to do quiet, unseen work that still brought light to others. He thought back to a day months ago when Elijah's face had graced the cover of Forbes under a bold headline. The man who revolutionized aviation, billionaire Elijah Reid. Marcus hadn't called to congratulate him. Not because he wasn't proud, but because he knew that fame and recognition were never what he sought. Marcus found meaning in smaller things. A heartfelt conversation with a stranger, words of encouragement to someone struggling, or simply rising after being knocked down by society's biases. The plane began to move, taxiing down the runway. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing the weather and details of the flight. Marcus fastened his seatbelt and leaned back into his chair. In the first-class cabin, other passengers were preoccupied with their own routines. Some checked emails, others made phone calls, or reviewed documents with colleagues. Marcus closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, searching for a sense of calm in this fleeting moment. A memory surfaced of another flight long ago. Marcus and his mother had boarded a plane from Atlanta to New York, leaving everything behind after his father's death. He could still hear his mother's voice as she held his hand tightly and looked out the plane window. Son, God always has a plan for us. Trust him and keep moving forward, even when you can't see the road ahead. Those words had stayed with Marcus, guiding him through his darkest days. He whispered a silent prayer now, asking God to lead him, not just to his destination, but to a greater purpose. As the plane lifted off the ground, a weightless feeling swept over Marcus, bringing a faint smile to his face. He had no way of knowing that this flight would change his life forever. Not because he was the brother of a billionaire, but because of the challenges awaiting him, challenges that would redefine how he saw the world and how the world saw him. The first-class cabin of the Boeing 787 cruised steadily at over 30,000 feet. Soft, golden light streamed from the overhead fixtures, casting a serene and luxurious ambience. Passengers began to settle into their routines. A few opened laptops, others ordered drinks, while some reclined in their plush seats, embracing the comfort around them. Evelyn White, the lead flight attendant, moved gracefully through the cabin, conducting a routine check of the passengers' tickets. With her polished professionalism and practiced smile, her sharp eyes scanned the room, noticing every detail and movement. When she reached Marcus's seat, she hesitated briefly. Her gaze shifted from the ticket lying on the small table beside him to Marcus himself, her expression briefly betraying an unspoken uncertainty. Good evening, she said, her voice friendly but measured. I need to recheck your ticket, just to make sure everything is in order. Marcus looked up, faintly surprised but unbothered. Without a word, he picked up the ticket and handed it to her. Evelyn took it, examining it with deliberate care, turning it over and scrutinizing it far longer than she had with any other passenger. Her thoroughness felt disproportionate, and it didn't go unnoticed. A few passengers nearby began to glance in their direction, their curiosity piqued. Is there a problem? Marcus asked, his voice low and composed. Evelyn handed the ticket back to him, offering a faint smile that struggled to mask her discomfort. No, everything's fine. Thank you for your cooperation. Marcus nodded, placing the ticket back on the table without further comment. He made no outward display of emotion, but the subtle difference in how Evelyn treated him compared to the other passengers was unmistakable. Across the aisle, Charles Mackenzie, the silver-haired man in the gray suit, let out a faint, derisive chuckle. Lowering the business magazine in his hands, he cast Marcus a sidelong glance filled with thinly veiled disdain. "Let me guess," Charles said loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "Some rapper or athlete. A guy like you couldn't afford this ticket otherwise." The air in the cabin grew still for a moment, tension thickening as a few passengers shifted awkwardly in their seats. Some turned their attention elsewhere, pretending not to have heard, while others remained silent, their eyes darting between Marcus and Charles. Charles smirked, flipping his magazine back open as if his words required no further elaboration. Marcus turned slowly to face him, his calm gaze meeting Charles's pointed stare. There was no anger in Marcus's eyes, only a quiet, resolute composure, as though this moment was one of many he had endured before. Without saying a word, Marcus turned back to the window, where sunlight pierced through the endless expanse of white clouds. The steady hum of the plane's engines filled the silence, yet the unspoken tension between Marcus and Charles lingered, thick and heavy, refusing to dissipate. Marcus leaned back in his seat, his eyes fixed on the window. Outside, the endless expanse of blue sky stretched wide, morning light glinting softly off the silver wings of the plane. He tried to focus on the serene view, but the sting of Charles's mocking words and Evelyn's scrutinizing gaze lingered in his mind, refusing to fade. Suddenly, something below the wing caught his attention. Through the oval window, Marcus spotted a group of ground crew loading luggage onto a cart. Most of them worked efficiently, their movements precise and professional. But one man in the group drew his focus. Marcus's suitcase, a worn but well-kept brown leather bag, was tossed carelessly onto the concrete by the worker. The sound of the impact seemed so loud in Marcus's mind that he almost thought he could hear it from his seat. He frowned as he watched the bag get kicked aside like a lifeless object before it was finally thrown onto the conveyor belt with disinterest. He inhaled deeply, trying to steady himself. This time, however, silence wasn't an option. He reached over and pressed the call button for the flight attendant. Within seconds, Hannah, the young attendant assigned to his section, approached. Her face betrayed a hint of irritation, and though she wore a polite smile, her eyes revealed a distinct lack of warmth. "Yes, sir? Is there something I can assist you with?" she asked in an even tone. Marcus gestured toward the window, where his bag was still visible on the conveyor belt. "That suitcase is mine. I just saw one of the ground crew throw it to the ground. Can you do something to ensure it's handled properly moving forward?" Hannah glanced out the window, her expression indifferent as her eyes landed on the bag. With a shrug, she said, "It's just luggage. What's the big deal?" Marcus straightened in his seat, his gaze sharpening. His voice remained calm and steady, but there was no mistaking the conviction in his words. "Respecting passengers' belongings is part of your job. I expect it to be treated properly, not tossed around like garbage." Hannah blinked, momentarily caught off guard by his firmness. But instead of addressing his concern, she simply raised an eyebrow and turned on her heel. "I'll notify the supervisor," she said dismissively, her tone flat, as she walked away. Marcus watched her retreating figure, a wave of disappointment rising in his chest. He couldn't fathom why such a simple request was met with such indifference and lack of professionalism. Even so, Marcus refused to let his frustration consume him. He leaned back into his seat with a sigh, closing his eyes. He sought calm within himself, a quiet refuge to navigate this moment without letting it break him. Inwardly, he offered a silent prayer. "Lord, help me to hold on to my faith. Teach me how to face injustice with humility and grace." Marcus tried to keep his composure, but his heart pounded at the thought of Hannah's dismissive attitude and the rough handling of his suitcase. It wasn't just a piece of luggage. It symbolized in some way his pride and dignity. From a young age, Marcus had learned to endure the scrutinizing looks and less than kind remarks. As the brother of a black billionaire, he understood that success or pedigree would never be enough to erase the biases people projected onto him. Marcus had always chosen silence as his armor, but this time, he felt a quiet anger rising within him, simmering just beneath the surface. Across the aisle, Charles Mackenzie, still engrossed in his magazine, occasionally cast a glance at Marcus, his expression bordering on provocation. The tension in the first-class cabin was palpable, even as no words were exchanged. Marcus tightened his grip on the armrest, then released it with a sigh. He leaned back, tilting his head toward the softly illuminated ceiling of the plane, the gentle light serving as a reminder of faith and calm. A verse from Romans 12 verse 19 surfaced in his mind. "Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath, for it is written, 'It is mine to avenge. I will repay,' says the Lord." Marcus closed his eyes, as if releasing the anger clawing at his peace. Yet deep inside, a question echoed. How much longer must things stay this way? From across the cabin, Evelyn White observed Marcus. She hadn't overheard the earlier conversation between him and Hannah, but Marcus's demeanor, calm yet resolute, left an impression on her. Evelyn's mind drifted to the moment she had initially checked Marcus's ticket. She realized now that perhaps her unconscious biases had influenced her actions. Watching Charles's condescending smirk and Hannah's indifference, a sense of unease stirred within her. Something about this situation felt undeniably wrong. Determined, Evelyn made her way to Marcus. She stopped by his seat and bent slightly to speak to him, her voice softer than before. "I'm sorry if anything has made you uncomfortable. Is there something I can do for you?" Marcus opened his eyes, looking at her. He was momentarily surprised by her shift in tone, but he simply shook his head, his voice gentle. "No, thank you. I'm fine." Evelyn nodded, but she lingered for a moment, her gaze searching for something in Marcus, perhaps understanding or perhaps forgiveness. Finally, she turned and walked away, carrying with her a complex mix of regret and resolve. Marcus watched her retreating figure. A faint glimmer of hope stirred within him, a belief that change, however small, could begin with one person. He leaned back in his seat, closed his eyes once more, and silently prayed. "Lord, guide me through these trials, and help me see your light even in the darkest moments." Evelyn White returned to the service station at the rear of the first-class cabin. Leaning lightly against the small counter, she cast a quiet gaze over the passengers. She observed each one in turn. Charles Mackenzie with his mocking smirk, Hannah with her aloof demeanor, and finally, Marcus, sitting silently by the window, his face calm yet distant. A knot of unease tightened in Evelyn's chest. She thought back to how she had checked Marcus's ticket earlier, to the unspoken suspicion she'd harbored from the start. As the lead flight attendant, she had always prided herself on being fair and professional, but today, she wondered if her own biases had clouded her judgment. Taking a deep breath, she approached Hannah, who was stationed at the beverage counter, carefully preparing a drink for another passenger. Evelyn spoke softly, her tone gentle but firm. "Hannah, can we talk for a moment?" Hannah looked up, surprised. "Of course, is something wrong?" Evelyn lowered her voice to avoid drawing attention. "I noticed you interacted with the passenger in 2A earlier. Was there an issue?" Hannah shrugged, her expression indifferent. "Not really. He was just complaining about his suitcase. I told him it wasn't worth making a fuss over." Evelyn's brow furrowed, her tone growing more serious. "Isn't it our responsibility to ensure the comfort and respect of our passengers? Even if it's just a suitcase, it's still their personal property. We need to do better." Hannah hesitated, a flicker of embarrassment crossing her face, but she said nothing further. Evelyn didn't scold her. Instead, she gave her a firm but understanding look before walking away. Evelyn made a decision. She approached Marcus again, this time with a different mindset. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her voice softer, tinged with sincerity. "May I have a word with you?" Marcus turned to her, his expression no longer guarded. He nodded. "I want to apologize on behalf of our team for any inconvenience you've experienced," Evelyn said. "I'll also personally ensure that your suitcase is handled with care for the rest of this flight." Marcus studied her for a moment, as if gauging the genuineness of her words. Then, he offered a faint but warm smile. "Thank you. I understand that things aren't always perfect. What matters is how we choose to address them, Evelyn was taken aback by his response. His words carried a quiet grace, a strength that didn't come from confrontation, but from enduring and rising above challenges. "We'll strive to do better," she replied, meeting his eyes with a look of genuine respect and understanding. As she walked away, Evelyn felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She couldn't undo what had already happened, but she could control how she treated others moving forward. As the plane continued its journey through the endless expanse of white clouds, Marcus sat quietly, a sense of calm returning to him. He knew there would still be challenges ahead on this flight, but one thing had become clear. Change could start with small acts, born from one person's sincerity. The baggage claim area at Los Angeles International Airport was as bustling as ever. The conveyor belts hummed steadily as suitcases rolled down in an endless procession. Passengers gathered in clusters, their eyes scanning eagerly for their belongings. In one corner of the area, Darren Thompson, the CEO of the airline, stood with a group of senior staff. Dressed in a sleek black suit, his silver-streaked hair neatly combed and thin-framed glasses enhancing his stern demeanor, Darren exuded authority. Yet his expression betrayed a flicker of excitement. Today was a significant day. "Mr. Reid is on his way," Darren announced, his voice firm but laced with anticipation. "This man is unlike any owner I've worked with. He's private, rarely appears in public, but from everything I've heard, he's incredibly sharp and decisive." "What does Mr. Reid look like?" one of the nearby staff asked curiously. Darren shrugged, a confident smile tugging at his lips. "I've never met him in person, but I've read about him, a very different kind of leader. He doesn't boast or seek attention, but every decision he makes commands respect. Today, we have our chance to make a strong first impression. Let's make sure we get it right." Not far away, Greg, the check-in agent, was chatting with Evelyn White and Hannah. None of them had the faintest idea that Marcus Reid, the passenger they had just served or mistreated, was the very man they now awaited. "What do you think the new boss is like?" Greg asked, a trace of cynicism in his tone. "Hope he's not one of those types who nitpick over every little thing." Evelyn, still haunted by her earlier interaction with Marcus, remained silent. A gnawing guilt and a creeping sense of dread stirred within her. The automatic doors leading to the baggage claim suddenly slid open. All eyes turned toward the figure stepping through, Marcus Reid. He walked in with a calm confidence, pulling a small suitcase behind him. His simple leather jacket and jeans made him blend in effortlessly with other passengers, but there was an unmistakable gravity about him. His deep, resolute gaze and composed demeanor seemed to draw attention without effort. Darren recognized Marcus immediately. He'd seen his photo in internal documents and couldn't mistake him. Darren's face lit up, and he strode quickly toward Marcus, his hand outstretched and a broad smile on his face. "Mr. Reid, it's an honor to finally meet you in person," Darren exclaimed with genuine enthusiasm. "I'm Darren Thompson, CEO of the airline. We've been eagerly awaiting your arrival and look forward to collaborating with you on the transformation of our system." Darren's words landed like a thunderclap in the otherwise quiet space. Greg, Evelyn, and Hannah froze, their faces painted with disbelief. "Mr. Reid?" Greg repeated, his voice catching. "He's Marcus Reid?" Evelyn's face turned pale. She couldn't believe what she was witnessing. The unassuming man she had scrutinized and doubted so thoroughly on the flight was the owner of the airline itself. Marcus shook Darren's hand, his grip firm, but his expression unreadable. His eyes flicked briefly toward the group of employees, his gaze sharp and deliberate. He studied each of them in turn, his calm demeanor masking a deeper contemplation. "Well," Marcus said at last, his voice steady and measured, but with a weight that hung in the air, "this has been quite an introduction. I gather none of you expected to meet me under these circumstances." No one answered. The silence was deafening, broken only by the steady hum of the conveyor belts and the sound of suitcases rolling across the floor. Evelyn felt each word Marcus spoke strike her like a quiet, pointed rebuke. Marcus lingered for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle, before turning back to Darren. "We have a lot of work ahead of us. I trust your team is ready for some big changes." "Absolutely, sir," Darren replied quickly, though a flicker of unease crossed his face as he glanced at the employees frozen nearby. The atmosphere in the baggage claim area grew eerily silent. Darren Thompson maintained his broad smile as he stood beside Marcus, but he quickly sensed the awkwardness enveloping his staff, particularly Evelyn, Greg, and Hannah. Marcus gently withdrew his hand from Darren's handshake and turned to face the group of employees. His gaze moved slowly, deliberately across each of them. The weight of his silence was enough to make them squirm. Greg was the first to lower his head, unable to meet Marcus's eyes. The words he had muttered at the check-in desk echoed hauntingly in his mind. Another one of them sneaking into first class. Beside him, Evelyn's face had gone pale. She recalled the moment she had scrutinized Marcus's ticket with suspicion and the way she had stood by, silent, as Charles Mackenzie's discriminatory remarks rang out in the cabin. Marcus crossed his arms over his chest. His voice, deep and steady, finally broke the silence. I imagine you're all quite surprised to learn that the man you look down on is, in fact, the owner of this airline. Greg froze, his posture rigid. Evelyn pressed her lips together, and Hannah turned away, unable to face Marcus. Who did you think I was on that flight? Marcus continued, his voice calm, but each word sharp, cutting through the tension like a knife. Just another nameless black passenger? Someone who didn't belong in first class. Greg stammered, trying to defend himself. I didn't mean... Marcus raised a hand, cutting him off, his expression cold and unyielding. There's no need to explain. I heard everything. I saw everything. He paused, turning his attention to Evelyn, who stood motionless, her face a portrait of regret. Marcus's voice was firmer now, addressing her directly. Ms. White, you're the lead flight attendant, correct? You're responsible for ensuring that all passengers are treated with fairness and respect. So tell me, why did you stand by and allow a passenger to be subjected to blatant discrimination on your flight? Evelyn lowered her head, her voice trembling as she replied. Mr. Reid, I'm sorry. I was wrong. I have no excuse. Marcus let her words hang in the air for a moment before turning to Darren, who stood beside him, his earlier confidence replaced with unease. Marcus spoke again, his tone measured but resolute. Mr. Thompson, if your staff cannot see the worth of a person beyond their skin color, attire, or demeanor, then perhaps they aren't fit to work for an airline striving for change. Darren nodded immediately, his voice grave. Mr. Reid, I couldn't agree more. We'll conduct a thorough review of our workplace culture and implement mandatory training to ensure this never happens again. Marcus acknowledged Darren with a small nod, but didn't leave just yet. Instead, he turned back to the group of employees, his gaze softening slightly, replaced with a calm yet undeniable authority. Today, you reminded me of what my family and I have endured countless times, being underestimated, disrespected, and judged solely because of the color of our skin. But this isn't just my story. It's the story of millions of people who only ask for one thing: to be treated as equals. His words hung heavy in the air, a quiet yet powerful indictment. Evelyn felt each syllable pierce through her, forcing her to confront her silence when she should have spoken up. Marcus's gaze lingered on each of them, his voice steady as he delivered his final words. You have a chance to change, but that change has to start with you. If it doesn't, then you don't belong here. Evelyn lifted her head, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She took a deep breath, ready to step forward and say something, anything, but Marcus had already turned and begun walking away. He didn't need their answers. Their silence had spoken volumes. Evelyn White stood motionless for a moment after Marcus walked away. The air in the baggage claim area remained heavy, as if his words still echoed through the space. Evelyn felt a deep, unsettling shift within herself. Not just because she had made a mistake, but because Marcus had handled it with such poise and humanity that it made her ashamed. Greg exhaled, breaking the silence. Well, I didn't expect that. He's really Marcus Reid. What do we do now? Hannah shook her head, still unable to find her voice. Evelyn didn't respond. She knew Greg and Hannah might try to brush this off as an unfortunate incident. But to her, it was far more than that. It wasn't just a lesson, it was a reckoning. What had she done? She had let unconscious biases cloud her judgment, allowed fatigue and routine to blur the principles she once prided herself on upholding. Unable to bear the weight of her thoughts, Evelyn turned on her heel and walked briskly toward Marcus, who was now standing near the exit, deep in conversation with Darren. Marcus noticed Evelyn approaching. He didn't look surprised. Instead, he stood still, his eyes steady, waiting. Evelyn drew a deep breath before speaking. "Mr. Reid, may I have a moment of your time?" Marcus nodded, his expression firm but not unkind. Evelyn clasped her hands tightly in front of her, her voice trembling but sincere. "I want to apologize. Truly apologize for what I did and for what I didn't do. I let my own biases affect how I saw you. Instead of treating you like any other passenger, or rather, as a human being who deserves respect, I doubted you. I failed you." She lifted her head, her eyes glistening with emotion. "As the lead flight attendant, I should have done better. I should have spoken up when I saw inappropriate behavior instead of staying silent. You were right. My job isn't just about service. It's about ensuring fairness for everyone." Marcus studied her silently, his expression unreadable. The lack of immediate response made Evelyn's heart race, but she pressed on. "I don't expect you to forgive me immediately, but I promise you this. I will change. I will do better, not just in my work, but in how I treat everyone. No passenger will ever go through what you experienced again." Marcus's gaze softened slightly. He nodded, his voice calm yet firm. "Evelyn, an apology doesn't undo what's been done. What matters is what you choose to do from here on out. If you truly want to change, remember this. Respect isn't optional, it's a responsibility." Evelyn nodded fervently, her resolve evident even as her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "I understand, and I won't forget it." As Evelyn turned to walk back, she felt as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. But she also knew that an apology was only the first step. She would need to prove her commitment through action, not just to make amends with Marcus, but to restore her own sense of integrity. From a distance, Darren watched Marcus with admiration. Though he couldn't hear the entire conversation, he could sense that Marcus had done something remarkable, not just to inspire one person, but perhaps to ignite a shift within the system itself. When Evelyn returned to where Greg and Hannah stood, she looked at her colleagues, her voice firm but earnest. "We were wrong, and from now on, I think each of us needs to rethink how we do our jobs. There's no place for bias here anymore." Greg said nothing, though his face showed a hint of introspection. Hannah gave a small nod, as though the gravity of the moment had finally reached her. Marcus walked out of the baggage claim area, leaving behind a group of people confronting their own consciences. He knew none of them were perfect, and he didn't expect immediate change. But he also knew that even a small spark of recognition, a willingness to change, was enough to begin a new journey. The baggage claim area remained crowded, but the space around Darren Thompson, Marcus Reid, and the airline staff felt frozen in time. Marcus's words, "This discriminatory behavior cannot continue," hung heavily in the air, reverberating in the minds of everyone present. Darren swallowed hard, striving to maintain his composure. As a seasoned CEO, he had weathered many crises, but the weight of this moment pressed on him in an unfamiliar way. He knew the reputation of the airline was at stake, but more importantly, so was the trust of the man standing before him, the new owner, Marcus Reid. Turning to Marcus, Darren spoke with resolute conviction. "Mr. Reid, I couldn't agree more. Behavior like this has no place in our culture. All employees involved will be immediately suspended pending investigation. We will adopt a zero-tolerance policy toward any form of discrimination." His words cut through the tension like a blade. Greg, Evelyn, and Hannah stood in stunned silence. While they had anticipated serious consequences, hearing Darren announce suspensions made the gravity of the situation inescapably real. Greg froze, his gaze glued to the floor. The mocking comment he had made at the check-in desk, words he dismissed as an offhand remark, now echoed in his head as damning proof of his unprofessionalism. Evelyn, though braced for this, still felt a crushing weight in her chest. There was no excuse for her silence during the flight. Silence when Charles Mackenzie made prejudiced remarks. Silence when Marcus spoke about his mishandled luggage. Hannah, too, bowed her head, her expression filled with worry and shame. She knew her dismissive attitude toward Marcus's concerns wasn't just a minor lapse in judgment, but a glaring failure of respect. Marcus's gaze swept over the group, pausing on each individual. No one could meet his eyes. He inhaled deeply before speaking, his voice calm yet commanding. Your actions today serve as a reminder to me and to everyone that fairness is still not guaranteed for everyone. That has to change. He paused, locking eyes with Greg. Greg, you decided I didn't belong in first class based on my skin color and how I was dressed. You even made a disparaging comment, as though I didn't deserve to be there. Tell me, how does it feel now to learn that I'm the owner of this airline? Greg looked up, his face pale. He stammered, his voice trembling. Mr. Reid, I don't know what to say except that I'm sorry. I was wrong, and I truly regret it. Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, his eyes shifted to Evelyn. Evelyn, you are the lead flight attendant. Your role is not just to serve passengers, but to lead your team and ensure that every passenger is treated with fairness. What did you do when I was subjected to prejudice? You stood by. You said nothing. How can you guarantee this won't happen again? Evelyn took a shaky breath, her voice choked with emotion. Mr. Reid, I have no excuse. I was wrong, but I promise you, I will change. I won't let prejudice influence how I do my job again. Marcus gave a slight nod before turning to Hannah. Hannah, how did you respond when I brought up the issue with my luggage? You said, it's just luggage. Did you stop to think about how a passenger might feel seeing their belongings treated like trash? Hannah's voice came out as a whisper. Sir, I'm deeply sorry. I didn't think it through, and I promise to do better. Marcus surveyed the three of them, his gaze softening slightly. When he spoke again, his tone was steady, almost reflective. Today, you missed the opportunity to show kindness and respect, values that should be the foundation of any organization. But mistakes can be lessons, and change starts with acknowledging them. Darren stepped forward, his agreement clear in his firm tone. All of you will be suspended immediately while we conduct a thorough investigation. In addition, we will implement mandatory training to ensure a culture of fairness and respect is upheld across the organization. None of the three protested. Greg, Evelyn, and Hannah nodded silently, accepting the decision. Yet in their hearts, regret mingled with a newfound determination to change. The air around the baggage claim remained heavy. Marcus's gaze swept over Greg, Evelyn, and Hannah, a final, measured assessment before he spoke. His voice, deep and deliberate, carried weight, commanding attention without the need for volume. Today, Marcus began, his tone steady and firm. You missed an opportunity to show kindness, respect, and compassion, not just to me, but to every passenger on that flight. He paused, his eyes locking onto Greg, who stood frozen, his head bowed, unable to meet Marcus's gaze. Greg, Marcus addressed him. I understand that working the check-in desk can be stressful, and you likely deal with difficult passengers every day. But that does not excuse how you treated me. You made a decision, based on what? The color of my skin? The way I was dressed? Or simply because I didn't fit your idea of what a first-class passenger should look like? Greg's head lifted slowly, his face pale. His voice trembled as he stammered. Mr. Reid, I'm truly sorry. I was wrong. I have no excuses. I just hope you can give me a chance to make it right. Marcus held his gaze for a moment longer, his expression unreadable, before giving a small, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledging Greg's regret without yet granting absolution. Next, Marcus turned to Evelyn, who straightened her posture, bracing herself for his words. Evelyn, he said, his tone softening slightly, but still resolute. You're the lead flight attendant. Passengers like me look to you to step in and ensure fairness when something isn't right. But on that flight, what did you do? Evelyn bit her lip, her eyes glistening. She drew a deep breath before answering, her voice filled with raw emotion. I stayed silent. I let things happen without intervening, even though I knew I should have done better. I failed in my role, sir, and for that, I am deeply sorry. Marcus regarded her for a moment, his gaze softening as he noted the genuine remorse in her expression. But he knew that remorse alone wasn't enough. It had to be followed by action. An apology isn't enough, Evelyn, Marcus said. You need to understand that silence in moments like these is not neutrality. It's acceptance of injustice. And as the lead flight attendant, you cannot allow that to happen. Evelyn nodded emphatically, a tear rolling down her cheek. I understand, sir. I will never let it happen again. Finally, Marcus turned to Hannah, who stood a few steps away, her hands tightly clasped together. She avoided his gaze, but she knew there was no escaping this moment. Hannah, Marcus called her name, his voice low but weighted with significance. Do you remember your response when I raised a concern about my luggage? What did you say? Hannah exhaled shakily, summoning the courage to reply. Her voice was small but steady. I said, "It's just luggage." Marcus nodded, repeating her words. "It's just luggage." Do you think that was an appropriate response to a passenger who paid for your service? A passenger who trusted this airline to treat him with care? Hannah shook her head, her eyes welling with tears. No, sir. I was wrong. I had no right to dismiss you like that, and I regret it deeply. Marcus regarded her for a beat, then spoke, his tone gentler now. Hannah, I don't need your apology. What I need is for you to understand that every passenger is more than just someone paying for a service. They are human beings with emotions, with expectations. It is your responsibility to treat them with respect and kindness, not indifference. Marcus stepped back slightly, addressing all three of them. His gaze was no longer cold, but carried a sense of understanding and hope. Mistakes are inevitable, Marcus said, his voice softer now. But what matters isn't the mistakes you've made today. It's how you choose to change tomorrow. This isn't just about your jobs. It's about how you see people and how you treat them. The three of them nodded in unison, their eyes reflecting a mix of regret, determination, and a glimmer of hope. After Marcus finished his admonition, the entire room sank into silence. Greg, Evelyn, and Hannah said nothing more. They knew that any justification was futile, and now only their actions could prove whether they had truly learned from this lesson. Darren Thompson, standing near Marcus, stepped forward. His face was stern, yet his eyes reflected alignment with everything Marcus had just said. As the CEO of the company, Darren understood this was not merely an issue of discipline. It was an opportunity to rebuild trust and establish a new standard. He turned to the group of employees, his voice steady and resolute. Greg, Evelyn, Hannah, you are hereby suspended effective immediately while we conduct a thorough investigation into the matter. Greg flinched slightly, as though the words had landed a physical blow. Evelyn nodded, accepting the decision without protest. Hannah turned away, her eyes glistening with tears, knowing there was nothing left to do but face the consequences. Darren continued, his tone growing even more firm. But suspension is not the only consequence. Over the next 2 weeks, every employee, from flight attendants to ground staff, will participate in a mandatory training program on culture, service attitude, and respect for customers. A zero-tolerance policy will be implemented. If anyone is found engaging in discriminatory behavior or disrespect, whether they are a veteran employee or newly hired, they will be terminated immediately. The three stood silent, Darren's words sharp and unyielding, leaving no room for debate. Marcus nodded slightly, showing his agreement with Darren's decision. He looked at the group of employees again, his voice softening, though it still carried the weight of expectation. You've heard, Mr. Thompson. This isn't just about discipline. It's an opportunity to learn, to change, and to prove that you can do better. He paused, his gaze settling on Evelyn. Evelyn, you have the experience and potential to become an excellent leader. But leadership isn't just about giving orders. It's about acting. It's about stepping up when something feels wrong, even in the smallest of moments. I hope that when you return, You'll be the example others look to. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears as she looked at Marcus. She bowed her head, her voice trembling with emotion. Mr. Reid, I don't know what to say except thank you for giving me this chance. I won't let you down. Marcus gave her a brief nod before turning to Greg and Hannah. Greg, he said, you're young and have plenty of time to grow. Today's mistake doesn't define who you are, but how you correct it will say everything. I hope that next time you meet a passenger, you won't see them through the lens of bias, but as a person. Greg swallowed hard and nodded slowly. He knew he had made a grave error, and Marcus's words felt like a final lifeline to redemption. Hannah, Marcus continued, none of us are born perfect. But indifference is the worst thing in a service profession. Remember, even the smallest action you take can make a huge difference in a passenger's experience. I hope you'll keep that in mind when you return. Hannah lowered her head, her voice soft but sincere. I will, sir. Thank you for giving me this chance. Darren stepped beside Marcus, his voice firm and unwavering as he addressed the group. Don't treat Mr. Reid's words as mere advice. See them as an opportunity to become better employees. And above all, better people. The employees nodded in unison, the tension in the room gradually subsiding. But they all understood that change wouldn't come from words. It had to start with actions. Marcus turned to Darren, his voice now gentler. Mr. Thompson, I trust you'll lead this team through the challenge. If you need support, don't hesitate to reach out. Darren smiled faintly. Thank you, Mr. Reid. We won't let you down. Marcus took a step back, his eyes sweeping across the room one last time. Never forget, he said, his voice ringing clear. Every passenger who steps onto our planes carries their own hopes, expectations, and stories. Make sure they leave feeling they chose the right place to trust. And that begins with you. His words hung in the air, the silence that followed laden with meaning. Then Marcus turned and walked away, leaving Darren and the employees behind with a renewed determination, not just to change the way they worked, but to change who they were. As Marcus stepped out of the baggage claim area, the atmosphere seemed lighter. Yet for those who remained, Darren, Evelyn, Greg, and Hannah, the weight of his words lingered, echoing in their minds like a solemn reminder of what had transpired. Darren turned to the group, his voice steady and resolute. You've all heard what Mr. Reid said. This isn't just a lesson for today. It's a wake-up call. A wake-up call about how we work, how we serve our customers, and how we build our culture. If you can't commit to change, step aside. But if you're ready to take responsibility and do better, I believe you can rise above this. Greg nodded, the regret in his eyes evident. He understood that this wasn't just about keeping his job. It was an opportunity to prove that he could learn and grow from his mistakes. Hannah exhaled slowly, feeling as though a weight had been lifted. Marcus's words, while stern, carried a sense of encouragement, that she still had a chance to become a better version of herself. Evelyn remained silent, but her mind was made up. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was determined to begin again. Meanwhile, Marcus stepped through the doors into the bright expanse of the airport concourse. The morning sunlight streamed in, glinting off the sleek glass surfaces of the surrounding buildings. Pulling his small suitcase, he walked with measured confidence, his gaze fixed ahead as if envisioning something far greater. Waiting for him was an assistant, who greeted him with a warm smile. Mr. Reid, everything is prepared for your next meeting. We'll be meeting the advisory team at the office in 2 hours, she said respectfully. Marcus nodded, his smile faint but meaningful. Thank you. Today is an important day, not just for this airline, but for everything we're working to build. The assistant nodded, clearly moved by his quiet determination. A month later, changes at the airline were already making an impact. Every employee, from ground staff to flight attendants, participated in mandatory training programs on culture, service, and respect. Regular workshops on equality and empathy were held, fostering a deeper understanding of the values the company sought to uphold. Evelyn White emerged as one of the most proactive contributors to the reform. She not only transformed her own approach to her work, but also encouraged her colleagues to embrace the new standards. She emphasized that even the smallest actions could create a significant difference in a passenger's experience. Greg and Hannah also embraced the changes. Greg dedicated himself to the training sessions, working to unlearn his biases and reshape how he interacted with passengers. Hannah, once cold and indifferent, became noticeably warmer and more attentive, striving to serve passengers with genuine kindness. One afternoon, during a domestic flight from New York to Chicago, Evelyn saw Marcus Reid again. He hadn't announced his presence and simply sat quietly in first class, reading a book. Yet his presence alone was enough to make Evelyn feel a mix of pressure and gratitude. As the flight prepared to land, Evelyn gathered her courage and approached him. "Mr. Reid," she began, her voice measured and deliberate, "I just want to thank you again. The lesson you taught us didn't just change the way I approach my job, it changed the way I see life. Thank you for giving me that chance." Marcus closed his book and looked up, his expression warm and composed. He offered her a smile, a softer, more genuine smile than the one she'd seen before. "I don't need your thanks, Evelyn," he said. "What matters is that you chose to change. Don't stop here. Keep spreading that change to those around you." Evelyn nodded firmly, her eyes bright with determination. As Marcus stepped off the flight, he paused to look up at the clear, endless sky. A quiet sense of satisfaction filled him, not because he was the owner of the airline, but because he knew he had planted seeds of change. He understood that the journey ahead would be long, but with faith and determination, he believed that a better future was possible for everyone. The following day, in a grand press conference room at the airline's headquarters, Marcus Reid stood before a row of microphones. Flashes from cameras lit up the space continuously, and reporters from both major and minor outlets watched intently. This wasn't just an ordinary press conference. It was a pivotal moment, marking a turning point in the history of the airline. Marcus stood tall in a simple black suit, his expression calm, but carrying a palpable sense of determination. He took hold of the microphone, and his deep, steady voice resonated through the room. "Thank you all for being here today. I want to share a story, not about me, but about something I believe we all need to reflect upon." The room fell silent, with everyone hanging on his every word. "1 week ago, I had an unpleasant experience on a flight operated by the airline I've recently acquired. As a passenger, I was judged based on the color of my skin, the way I dressed, and the unconscious biases of those around me. But what disappointed me most wasn't the lack of respect directed at me. It was the lack of respect for the value of humanity itself." Marcus paused, his eyes scanning the audience, letting the weight of his words sink in. Discriminatory behavior doesn't just harm those targeted. It damages those who engage in it and the organizations they represent. It erodes trust, and trust is the most crucial element of any relationship, especially the one between an airline and its passengers. As he continued, his voice grew stronger, more resolute. "Today, I stand before you not to criticize or cast blame. I stand here to make a commitment. We are committed to creating an environment where every passenger is treated with respect and dignity, regardless of how they look or where they come from." Reporters began jotting down notes furiously. Marcus's words weren't just a promise. They were a declaration of the profound changes he was driving forward. "We have implemented a series of concrete measures to ensure that the culture of this airline changes at its core. Every employee, from flight attendants to ground staff, will participate in mandatory training programs on cultural awareness, respect, and service attitude. A zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior will be enforced. Furthermore, we will listen to our passengers, not just their complaints, but also their suggestions, so we can continue to improve." A reporter raised their hand, asking, "Mr. Reid, do you believe that a new policy can truly change the behavior of every employee?" Marcus offered a faint smile before replying. "I'm not naive enough to believe that everything will change overnight, but I do believe that change begins with willpower. If we never start, we'll never get anywhere. And if we can help each employee, each passenger, understand that kindness and respect are not optional but essential, then I firmly believe change is absolutely possible." A round of applause erupted in the room. Marcus's speech wasn't merely a promise. It was an inspiration for everyone present. His words quickly made headlines across major media outlets. Publications such as the New York Times, Forbes, and The Guardian ran articles with headlines like, "Marcus Reid, the man transforming airline culture. Respect and fairness, the message from the airline's new owner." Social media buzzed with excerpts from Marcus's speech, accompanied by praise for his composure, resolve, and humanity. Many people shared that they felt inspired by Marcus's story and had started reconsidering how they perceived and treated others in their daily lives. In an exclusive interview, a reporter asked Marcus what he hoped people would take away from this story. He responded, his voice slow and deliberate, carrying a deep sense of meaning. Kindness and respect are never optional. Misguided assumptions can lead to devastating consequences, not just for those we hurt, but for ourselves as well. Always remember, every person you encounter is carrying a story you don't know. So treat them with compassion and understanding. Under Marcus Reid's leadership, the airline embarked on a new chapter, not just in its operations, but in its service culture. And from that moment, Marcus's story became more than just a tale of a successful businessman. It became a testament to standing up for change and how the world treats one another, beginning with the small but profoundly meaningful steps. Marcus Reid's journey reminds us of the importance of respect and kindness in modern life. In an increasingly diverse and interconnected world, judging others based on bias or appearance isn't just wrong. It undermines the essence of humanity. To apply this lesson in life, we must strive to treat everyone with fairness and empathy. Listen, seek to understand rather than to judge. Kindness doesn't just create a better environment. It defines the quality of our character. The journey doesn't end here. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories. There's so much more to explore. Stay tuned for our next video.